Well, hello, good morning, wherever you are. If you're watching this live or afterwards, welcome to this third edition of James. So we're glad you're here tuning in. We're going to jump right into James. So if you have a Bible, you want to grab and turn to James chapter 1. That's where we'll be spending most of our time as we close out this chapter. For those of you who are maybe just tuning in, just want to let you know really briefly that you can interact with this class through an email we've created. The email is questionsforjames@bethelbfc.com or .org, excuse me, sorry. The link will probably be in the show notes as well, hopefully. You can also type a comment if you're watching live. I do watch this live after I've recorded it, so I'd love to interact with people or respond to any email. Haven't gotten any yet, so if you want to make use of that and throw out a question, throw out a comment, criticism, anything like that, you're welcome to do that. Well, we're going to look at two sections primarily. We're going to look at verses 16 through 18, and then we'll look at 19 through the end of the chapter. So starting with 16 to 18. I think I made a mistake. I think I should have put this section last week. When I was chopping up the whole book, I didn't exactly realize I hadn't really quite read through everything that I wanted to read. So when I started reading some of the commentaries, it said this section really applies to the section on temptations. I didn't really realize at the time. But there's some interesting stuff here that I think is important. I think some of the information here is a little bit flyover. You might check out a little bit, like I find myself. But there's a lot of really interesting pieces that I think we can spend some time on. So I'll read 16 to 18. This is chapter 1, James. It says, "Do not be deceived, my brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creation, of his creatures, excuse me." So this is a bit of a transitional verse, but it probably applies more to the section on temptation. So if you want to go back and watch that, you note this first verse where it says, "Do not be deceived, my brothers." It's very possible that that line, deceived, fits better with the section on temptations. If you recall, if you read verse 15, says, I'll read the end of verse 15, says, "Sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." And then the next sentence, "Do not be deceived, my brothers." So, where does that necessarily apply? Doesn't really matter a lot. But the idea of not being deceived is something that James is going to mention several times in this section that we look at today. So that's an important topic for James. But regardless of where you put the deceived, James wants to be clear that what is good comes from God. And this contrasts a little bit with what we read in the previous section with temptations. If you look back in verse 13, saying, people ought not to say that when they are tempted, they're being tempted by God. Well, now if you look down to verse 16, it seems as though James is trying to emphasize that while temptations do not come from God, every good gift and every perfect gift comes from God. Now, verse 17 is a little bit of a strange phrase because it says good and perfect gift as if those are different things. Actually, in the original language, the word for gift there's two different words used for gift. Some translations say good endowment. Some people have made a lot about what's being said there, although some people have pointed out that actually the first 8 words of this verse form a kind of poetic meter, a perfect hexameter, as they say, with six hard and short syllables in a perfect phrase like that, which appears only in this section of James. And so we think that it's very possible that this is a kind of poem. This is perhaps a bit of a song James is using in his teaching. Every good gift, every perfect gift is from above. So the point is that good things come from God the Father. Where it says Father of lights, you can think the Father of lights as though the one who created the heavenly lights, the moon, the sun, the stars. He is the Father up and above who created and sustains all things. And when you see this phrase that there is no variation or shadow due to change, there's some different translations there. At least in the ESV, you can see an alternate note, which as this could also read, variation due to a shadow of turning. This is actually where we get the phrase, "And great is thy faithfulness. There is no shadow of turning with thee." So it's this idea, you can almost think of it as this God who created the heavenly lights. He doesn't change. The moon moves, the sun turns, the earth turns around the sun, and there's casting shadows. But God is one whom there is no changing, casting shadow. Or it could mean just kind of alternating the light from the dark, similar to the way John uses often in his gospel and his epistles. There's no shadow, there's no darkness in God. He's all light and revealing. Those are sort of two ways you could be reading that verse. And then if you jump to verse 18, that God of his own will. So this is the prime example that James uses of the gifts now that come from God. That God of his own will, he brought us forth, us, the Christians, the believers, by the word of truth, the gospel, that we be kind of first fruits of his creatures. And so it's this idea of salvation is a sovereign act of God's will. Again, the word of truth, that phrase overwhelmingly refers to the gospel in the New Testament. So it's the idea primarily of salvation. That's the primary gift that is used as an example. Not that it's the only gift, but it's the first gift that James turns to. And when we think about first fruits, this language comes up in Romans, and we can think of the way that our conversion is like a taste of what's to come. The renewal and changed heart that comes in believers is a taste of how God is coming into creation and renewing all things. And so you can think of this great gift of redemption, which involves us, our hearts, but involves all of creation as well. That gift, this is this example that James uses of our conversion, which is a foretaste of what's to come. So that's most of what I'd say for verses 16 and 18. Again, don't skip that section. There's a lot there, but it probably is better applied to that temptation passage. So you can roughly summarize this section with all good things come from the unchanging and perfect God, and the greatest example of that is our conversion and our response to the gospel, which is a foretaste of what is to come. So let's turn now to verses 19 to 27, where we'll spend the rest of our time. I'll read this section. James writes, "Know this, my brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. But be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourself. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away, and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, to keep oneself unsustained from the world." So James is hitting on probably the most important theme of his little epistle, which is that true spirituality involves action. It's not just belief and hearing only. It involves applying the law. That's why I put on my doer shirt from our youth group retreat, which was on this passage. So let's start with let's work through. There's sort of 3 paragraphs, but they're all kind of one. They're one idea. This is one of the first sections where James spends a little bit more time on an idea. He's going to revisit this theme again in chapter 2, where he looks at faith without works. This is him giving us a little appetizer to that. James starts with 3 speeds that are probably opposite in our natural tendency, or at least very few of us have all of these speeds right. He tells us to be, if I can find it, he tells us to be quick at something, slow at something, and then slow at something else. So he tells us to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Hearing and speaking are kind of the same thing, you can imagine. And it's this idea of wanting to dominate a conversation and not really care for other people. It's this idea that wisdom is associated with the one who is patient and calm and is reserved, listens. You can compare this to many other verses of Old Testament wisdom. You think Psalm 17:27, whoever restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Or Proverbs 29:11, a fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds back. So they're two sides of the same coin, listening and speaking. And we don't often think of listening as a kind of active thing that we do quickly. It's more of a passive faculty. But isn't it true that it's something that we do have to do quickly? I mean, how many times do you, at least for me, I meet somebody and they share their name and then I immediately forget. It's because I didn't turn my listening ears on fast enough. And the idea of speaking, being slow to speak, is not that you have nothing to say. It's that if you're thinking back to Proverbs, a fool gives full vent to his spirit. I love the way that that's said. There's no lid on his foolish words that come out. Well, a wise man has those ideas under control. Again, not that they have nothing, not that they're empty-headed, but they know when to use their words. They think before they speak. And maybe even in situations where they may not like what someone else is saying. They may feel like there's something I need to say right now, but they're cool about it. They're calm. They're patient. They listen more. Again, they go back to listening. Before I speak, maybe I'm not understanding this entirely. Maybe I need to ask another question before I speak in. Very often we're in conversations and sometimes things get heated, or sometimes it's something we're very passionate about, and we just want to jump in with our ideas. And that's the fool. The fool is empty-headed. They don't have good things to say, and so they're the ones that want to jump in quickly with their own thoughts. Sorry, I'm just reading through my notes a little bit. But I think about this further. It means that we can believe all the right things and still be a fool. We can think all the correct thoughts about God and still be foolish in the way we speak. We can be too quick. We don't listen enough. And I think the person that this describes mostly is in Jesus. If you look at Jesus and the way he interacted with people, he was constantly asking questions. And it's not that he didn't know the answer to those questions. It was the style that he used and the way that he loved people and had a kind of selfless focus on them in the way he interacted with them. And I think that that's how we have to be in the way we interact with people in the world. We have this tendency, especially as Christians, to say we have the truth and we have to give it to people boldly. And I think there's a place for that. But I think this passage is telling us that it's not about the speed and quickness of our words. It's the kind of humility that comes, wisdom from being slow to speak and quick to listen. But what? Let's think about the heart issue of this, and I'll ask this question: why do we have a tendency to not listen and speak quickly? So what are the reasons? I think there's very often it's pride. It's pride in our own abilities. It's pride that we have something figured out. I like the sound of my own voice and I have to jump in and tell you how much I know. And very often, again, when we're not listening and it's just us all day, it's all about other people just become props in our own story. We're here, we're working out our own agendas, and you're here, and I'm just waiting for you to shut up so I can push my own agenda. It's very weird doing this lesson right now because there's no one in the room, and I'm kind of breaking what this passage sort of says. But that's why I hope if you write in a note, I will listen to what you say. But James is also very concerned about the anger behind our speech. And isn't it true that when we are quick to jump in, there's usually some kind of anger? I know for myself, sometimes I jump in and I say things I don't like because something that somebody says, it triggers me. I get really defensive. And sometimes I think there's this fear that, well, if I don't say something right now, no one else will. And there's this weird feeling that we're responsible. And, if I got to put you down, I got to put you back in your place. I shouldn't suffer a fool and I got to jump in right now. A wise person is calm and cool. They're going to let the things play out. They're going to trust God. They're going to listen. They're probably going to know when to speak in. That's why it takes wisdom. But they're not too quick to speak. But they don't have anger. They're full of love for other people. Even when people are saying things they don't agree with, they're able to say it. They're able to say it with compassion and with humility. And again, I think this is where our own testimony, our witness as Christians has been less than pure. We're very quick to jump in with our own opinions. And I think very often, what does the world think of Christians? The world thinks of Christians for good reasons sometimes not so much, but thinks of Christians as bigots. We don't want to listen. We just want to shove what we believe is true down people's throats. And listen, I believe that this is true. I believe the Bible's true. I believe we have to go out, we have to spread the word boldly. But I think the world ought to know us as people who listen, who are humble. Now, if the world is going to critique us, which they certainly will, let that not be for the way we interact. Let that be for the pure message of what we're saying. And again, I love the way that James says, receive with meekness the implanted word. So there's this idea of being meek with the word. I have the scripture, and scripture has to be my guide. It's not me coming up with fancy rhetoric to win souls. It's God's word. I'm just a messenger, and I receive it humbly. I think some of the best communicators of the gospel are people who just accept the Bible for what it is, and they just go out there and share it boldly with no pride. They're just heralding truth. They're just saying, look, Jesus loves you and died for you in the same way that they would share, share information from, there's something that happened in the news, there's, this, whatever. They're sharing information that happened because they really believe it. And it's not this, tactful, I'm going to twist you, I'm going to jump in, I'm going to manipulate the conversation. That's not how James wants us to interact with people. And this is where we often think that anger is justified, right? We think that being angry is needed in maybe more situations than is. Again, there's situations where we should be angry. God is angry at many things. But think back to the times when you've gotten angry. How many times do you think your anger helped the situation, right? I think back and I think more times than not, my anger did not help the situation. Now, there are times when probably times when I should have gotten more angry when I wasn't, but I think most of the time, I think my own anger, I think that many times it didn't actually help the situation very much. And I think a great example of this is social media and the things that we see and the way we interact, and we get so mad at things. We see things that are very anti-Christian, but we think that a kind of angry, quick response is, I don't know. I think it's pride. I think it's arrogance. We think that we can convince people. And again, sometimes I think maybe we do have to just take a calm step. Maybe we need to spend more time listening. Doesn't mean we accept what we're hearing, but maybe it means that we just take a moment to ask ourselves, why is this person saying this? What makes them say that? Maybe instead of firing back, we ask a question. I think that can be a good way of interacting with people. And don't we just naturally gravitate towards people that are like that? That when you're talking to them, does anybody want to hang out with somebody that just interrupts and tells you something about themselves? We like people that ask you questions. So as we go out and we interact with people, let's be those kinds of people. Where you walk away from the conversation, you say, boy, they didn't really say much. They just let me talk. They just asked me questions. I think that's how Christians ought to be when we interact. So that's quite a bit of. That's quite a bit on that section. Let's keep going. Now let's get into the doer section, which is, again, an important theme for James. And I think I always want to say this whenever I'm getting this subject. I think sometimes I know I've been uncomfortable with the topic of doing, and sometimes it starts to sound legalistic. This is how we're earning salvation. I really like this quote from the commentary I use where Doug Moo, if you've ever heard that name, he summarizes this really well, and this was a helpful quote in saying there's two sides that we have to hold just as strongly. There's the justification by faith alone, but also there's this radical call to discipleship that we have to follow. And so this quote that I love from Doug Moo, he says, Jesus' preaching is filled with overwhelming, amazing wonder of God's sovereign grace reaching down to sinful human beings in the gospel. But equally prominent is Jesus' summons to radical obedience, an obedience that is the necessary human response to God's grace. So both things have to be just as strongly emphasized. We cannot emphasize one without the other. And I think that James's primary message here is not so much to evangelize his listeners. Again, he's assuming they're Christians, and he wants to call them to a life of doing and not just hearing. Now, if we look at this picture that James uses of a person looking at their face in a mirror and forgetting, it's a little tricky to understand what exactly he's contrasting. There's been a number of suggestions. Some have suggested that it's the point is the thing you're looking at. You're looking at the natural law as opposed to your face, or it might be maybe it's the way you're looking. So there seems to be different words, whether you're, as it says, looks intently in ESV, or just looks into the perfect law. That word looking into is this kind of word that sometimes gets used for looking at a flower. You're steeping down and you're observing. Now, both of those words are mean a very intent look. And so it seems most likely that what he's really contrasting is the idea of forgetting from acting. So in one scenario, you look at your face and you forget. In the other, you're looking at the law and you remember. Not just remember, but you act. It leads to action. So he's contrasting the forgetting with the doing. You can also remember, too, that mirrors in this ancient world, they weren't the mirrors that we're used to today. They were polished metal. And so there was a very fuzzy, faint, warped picture. So you can kind of imagine why you would look at that kind of mirror and you might walk away and you might forget it very quickly. And I want to emphasize too that James is not pitting hearing and doing against each other. He's not saying, it's not that he's pulling the pendulum more towards the doing. He's emphasizing hearing and doing. Remember, he just said, be quick to listen. So we have to do both. We have to do and listen. In some ways, our doing proceeds from our listening, because what are we going to do if we're not listening? I think some Christians talk about it as though we need to just stop going to church. We need to stop meeting in a building. We need to just go out and be activists. Well, that's not really all that helpful if you don't know what you're supposed to do, right? You think of the Nike, you think of Nike, which says just do it, and you want to you want to throw something at the TV, like, do what? What are you asking me to do? And James doesn't tell us until the very end, but we'll get to that. But we have to start with listening. We have to start with hearing the word, studying the word, being in fellowship at your local church with other Christians. And then from there comes the doing. And James is very concerned that there are people who are listening and they're not doing. And, there's all kinds of ways that we might do that. We may come to church, we might sing, we might listen to the sermon and then go home. And then the rest of the week, we don't apply our faith in any real way. And in many different denominations and faiths in the Western Church, we have categories of belonging to the church, but then there's no real substance as the way your faith acts out. Maybe you're Roman Catholic and you're baptized as a baby, and then that's it. You just call yourself Catholic, but you never go to church. Or maybe Christians who, went to a camp and made a pledge of faith, but they've never been in church. So that's a kind of listening, but there's no doing and there's no action. Let me ask this, because I don't think it's so much that we forget. It's that we really don't do, right? Do we really forget what we're supposed to do? I don't know if it's so much the problem. Let me ask this question. Why do we forget to do? Like I was just saying before, I don't think that it's all about forgetting. I think forgetting is a kind of symbol for the way we just kind of casually move on from the doing and ignore it. And I think there's a multitude of ways that we do that. One way is we ignore responsibility. Maybe we believe, we justify it. Maybe we say I'm not required to be a disciple. Maybe we say, I'm too old, I'm too young, I don't know enough, I'm too inexperienced. Or maybe, like with most of us, we just don't care. We just ignore it and we hope it'll go away, and we just kind of play along one day at a time, not following God in our everyday life, and we ignore the clear commands. for however many people in the church this may be true. I don't know. But James is saying that if you are not doing, your religion is worthless and it's invalidated. Now, James moves in the next section to give an example of this. It's interesting that he says that true religion, his example of true religion is not the opposite of, he actually uses first bridling your tongue as an example. It's a kind of more passive thing. But if you bridle your tongue, he says, you deceive your heart and your religion is worthless. There's that deceiving again. And so James is very worried that somebody could be in church, maybe you're in the community of believers in some capacity, and you feel good. You say, I'm a Christian. I sing in the choir. I went to Sunday school ever since I was little, or again, I was baptized, or I had this card that James is concerned that there are people who are self-deceived, and his reasoning is because of these things. They don't bridle their tongue. That's one of the examples he uses, although there are many. And again, this is an area where we hurt our witness in the way that we don't bridle our tongue. If we go to church and then we go to work and we say all kinds of gross things, we say mean things about our spouse, or we jump in on crude jokes. It hurts our testimony, and it's not just your religion is worthless at that point because we're not bridling our tongue. Again, there's that theme of controlling your speech is something that James is very interested in. Then James tells us what true religion is. True religion, this is verse 27, true religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unsustained from the world. Turning back to, I know Isaiah is my go-to, but go back to Isaiah 1. I think it's 1. 1:16 and 17 says, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from my eyes, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's case. There's this idea in Scripture that people who help the people who are most vulnerable, which would have been orphans and widows in this society, is a mark of what true spirituality looks like. And that's where he goes in the example of doing. And he also lists being unstained from the world. So let me ask this question. What are we? Now, we're not in the same culture, but I think there's lots of similarities. Ask yourselves this now. What are we called to do? Well, I think using these two examples, I think we can start to imagine what that might be. So when we say visit orphans and widows in their affliction and keeping oneself unstained from the world. So keeping oneself unstained from the world, I think that could be you could see that as a category for following God's moral command, especially in the categories of not being sucked into the things that the world do, seeing the things the world says is good or okay, that we would say is not getting sucked into that, but following God's moral code. That means knowing Scripture and knowing what God's will is. God's will primarily for you is His commands. If you love Jesus, you'll keep His commands. And in some ways that's easy because it's true for all people. But where I think it gets a little bit more, it gets a little trickier is the orphans and widows. So, I think that there's an area of, I think you could chop this up in sins of omission and sins of commission. Not visiting the widows and orphans is a sin of omission. God commands us to help the poor and to help the needy around us. And so that's a sin of omission. And I think that will look different for you. I mean, if I was to do a show of hands, how many people have visited widows and orphans? I think the numbers might be low. But I think there's some people for whom that's been a passion and a gifting for them. And I think maybe the question is, what are your passions and gifting that you think that you can use? So I think that there's freedom for us to explore that. So what we are called to do, I think in some ways there's some flexibility in that. Again, the law of God is clear and perfect, and that doesn't change and applies to all people. But then what we do could be different. There could be things that God is nudging you, gifting that you have, and you might start to say, I'm being called to do this, and I think that God has gifted me and I've been given this desire. Well, take that step and do. And I was going to turn there, but I remember it. James says, you will be blessed in your doing. And so I think that there's this encouragement that God will bless your doing. So take that step. I don't know what it'll be, but it probably will lead to something else. There's needs all around us, and Bethel is a church. Thankfully, there's many ways that we are able to serve the community, and it's really cool to see that different people having different passions and different, I can hear voices right upstairs now with some people that are hanging out with some students after school and just playing games and ministering to them. That's one thing I'm thinking. There's people that every week they serve the food bank and they have a passion for that. And so ask yourself that, what does it mean to be a doer? And what do I have that I can use? So that's all for this section. We're going to jump into chapters 2 next week. Again, if you want to write in an email or type a question, I'd love to interact with you some. Thank you.